The summer of 1943 hung heavy over Fort Benning, Georgia, where the red clay dust seemed to coat everything and everyone with the same suffocating sense of dread. Private James Miller stood in the equipment line, clutching a worn envelope from his mother back in rural Kentucky. Inside was a $15 bill, folded carefully with her shaky handwriting on a note that read, "Buy yourself something that might keep you safe, my boy." James was different from the other recruits. While they came from cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, he had grown up in the Appalachian foothills, where hunting squirrels with his grandfather's old rifle meant the difference between eating and going hungry. He was lean, quiet, and carried himself with the careful movements of someone who had learned early that noise and haste usually meant failure. The other men in his unit had noticed him immediately. Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a broad-shouldered man from Detroit with a voice like gravel, had taken particular interest in singling James out during drills. Thompson came from money, had attended 2 years of college before enlisting, and made sure everyone knew it. He surrounded himself with 3 other recruits who shared his taste for mockery: Billy Henderson from Philadelphia, a stocky guy with a perpetual smirk; Robert Donnelly from Boston, who spoke with an accent that dripped condescension; and Frank Kowalski from Chicago, whose laugh was always the loudest when someone else was the target. That afternoon, James made his way to the post exchange with his mother's $15. The other soldiers were buying cigarettes, playing cards, writing paper. James walked past all of it to the back corner where old Mr. Callahan, a veteran from the Great War, kept a small collection of personal firearms for sale. The old man's hands shook from what everyone whispered was shell shock, but his eyes were sharp as he watched James approach. What caught James's attention was a Springfield rifle, old and battered, with a scope that looked like it had seen better days. The wood stock was scratched, the metal showed spots of wear, but when James picked it up, it felt right. Balanced. True. "How much?" James asked quietly. Mr. Callahan studied him for a long moment. $15. "It ain't pretty, son, but I carried one like it through the Argonne forest. If you know what you're doing, it'll serve you better than any of that fancy gear these city boys are wasting their money on." James laid out his mother's bill on the counter, took the rifle, and walked back toward the barracks. He made it exactly 20 feet before Sergeant Thompson spotted him. Well. What do we have here?" Thompson's voice carried across the yard, drawing a crowd. "Miller finally bought himself a gun. Let's take a look at this masterpiece." James tried to keep walking, but Henderson blocked his path while Donnelly snatched the rifle from his hands. The 3 men passed it between them like it was contaminated, their laughter growing louder with each exaggerated inspection. "This piece of junk?" Donnelly held it up to the fading sunlight. "I've seen better rifles in a museum." "What did you pay for this relic, Miller?" $5. "15, James said quietly, his jaw tight. The laughter exploded. Thompson slapped his knee, tears forming in his eyes. $15. Henderson wheezed. "You got robbed, country boy. This thing looks like it survived the Civil War." Kowalski grabbed the scope, squinting through it. "The scope's crooked. The stock's cracked. Miller, you're gonna get yourself killed with this ridiculous excuse for a weapon." Other soldiers had gathered now, some laughing, others looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. James stood there, his face burning, his hands clenched at his sides. He could feel his grandfather's voice in his head, "A rifle ain't about how it looks, boy. It's about whether it shoots true when you need it to." Thompson finally handed the rifle back, his expression shifting from amusement to something colder. "Listen, Miller. When we ship out, you stay away from me and my boys. That $15 disaster is gonna jam when you need it most, and I don't want to be anywhere near you when it does. You're a liability." The crowd dispersed, the entertainment over. James walked to his bunk, set the rifle carefully on his footlocker, and sat down. His hands were shaking, but not from fear. From rage. From humiliation. From the bitter taste of being dismissed as less than, just like he had been his whole life for being poor, for being rural, for being different. That night, while the others played cards and drank bootleg whiskey, James took his rifle apart piece by piece. He cleaned every component, adjusted the scope using techniques his grandfather had taught him, tested the action until it moved smooth as silk. When he was done, he reassembled it and lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. They could laugh all they wanted. But James Miller knew something they didn't. When it mattered most, it wasn't the cost of your weapon that saved your life. It was knowing how to use it. 3 months later, James found himself in the belly of a transport ship crossing the Atlantic toward England. The ocean was rough, men were vomiting into buckets, and the air below deck smelled of sweat, diesel fuel, and fear. Thompson and his crew had continued their campaign of mockery throughout training, but James had learned to tune them out. He kept to himself, practiced with his rifle whenever possible, and counted the days until he could prove them wrong. The unit landed in southern England in November 1943, assigned to prepare for what everyone knew was coming, the invasion of France. They were stationed near a small village called Tidworth, where the rain never seemed to stop and the cold seeped into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. During a routine training exercise in the muddy fields outside camp, Thompson's harassment reached a new level. The platoon was practicing rapid deployment from foxholes, and James had been paired with Henderson for the drill. As they ran toward their assigned position, Henderson deliberately tripped him, sending James sprawling face-first into a puddle of freezing mud. The rifle flew from his hands, landing several feet away. Before James could get up, Thompson was standing over him, grinding his boot into James's back. "Stay down, Miller. That's where you belong. In the mud with that pathetic rifle of yours." The other soldiers had stopped to watch. Some looked away uncomfortably. Others laughed nervously. Henderson picked up James's rifle, holding it by the barrel like it was a dead animal. "You know what, Sarge? I think we should do Miller a favor. This thing is dangerous. We should report it as defective, get it confiscated. Save his life." James pushed himself up despite Thompson's boot, mud streaming down his face. "Give it back." "Or what?" Thompson leaned down, his face inches from James's. "You gonna cry to the lieutenant? Tell him the mean soldiers are picking on the poor Kentucky boy?" Something inside James snapped. He surged upward, breaking free from Thompson's boot, and drove his shoulder into the sergeant's midsection. They went down together, rolling in the mud. James got one solid punch to Thompson's jaw before Donnelly and Kowalski pulled him off. The lieutenant came running, his face red with fury. "What the hell is going on here?" Thompson stood up, wiping blood from his split lip, his eyes blazing with hatred. "Miller attacked me, sir. Unprovoked. He's unstable. Dangerous." James stood there, breathing hard, covered in mud, knowing that no one would believe his side. The lieutenant looked between them, his expression unreadable. "Both of you, report to my tent. Now." That night, James received formal disciplinary action. Kitchen duty for 2 weeks. Thompson received nothing, his story accepted without question. As James scrubbed pots in the mess hall, he could hear Thompson and his friends outside, their laughter carrying through the thin walls. "You're nothing, Miller. You'll always be nothing." December brought orders that changed everything. The unit was being deployed to the front lines in Belgium, where German forces had launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. What would later be called the Battle of the Bulge was tearing through Allied positions, and every available man was being rushed to hold the line. They flew in on cargo planes through weather so bad the pilots looked terrified. James sat clutching his rifle, watching Thompson across the aisle. The sergeant's usual confidence had been replaced by something else. His hands trembled slightly as he checked his equipment for the 3rd time. They landed in chaos. Snow falling so thick you could barely see 10 feet ahead. Artillery thunder rolling across the frozen landscape like the voice of God himself. Officers shouting orders that got lost in the wind. James's unit was assigned to a defensive position along a ridge overlooking a crucial supply route. "Dig in," the captain shouted. "Germans are pushing hard from the east. We hold this line or the entire sector collapses." James found himself positioned in a foxhole about 30 yards from where Thompson and his crew had dug in. The ground was frozen solid, making digging nearly impossible. His hands were numb within minutes despite his gloves. Around him, more experienced soldiers were sharing what little wisdom they had. "Keep your head down. Watch the tree lean. If you see movement, don't hesitate." Night fell fast and brutal. The temperature dropped below zero. James could hear German voices in the distance, speaking in sharp, clipped tones that carried across the snow. Flares went up periodically, turning the landscape into a nightmare shadowplay of white and black. Then he heard it. A sound he had been taught to recognize during training but had never heard in reality. The deep, droning growl of aircraft engines. Multiple engines. Big ones. Someone shouted, "Bombers! Incoming!" James looked up and saw them emerging from the low clouds, 3 German Junkers Ju-88s flying in formation, their bellies heavy with bombs meant for the American positions. Tracer fire lit up the sky as soldiers fired uselessly with their standard-issue rifles. The planes were too high, too fast, moving with terrible purpose toward the ridge. If you are rooting for James right now, take a moment and think about all the times someone doubted you because of where you came from or what you had. This is where everything changes. The moment of truth is coming. James pulled his rifle tight against his shoulder, his grandfather's voice clear in his memory. "You don't shoot where it is, boy. You shoot where it's gonna be. Lead the target. Breathe. Squeeze." He tracked the lead bomber through his scope, calculating wind, distance, the plane's speed. His finger found the trigger. Around him, soldiers were diving into foxholes, bracing for impact. James exhaled slowly and fired. The rifle's crack was swallowed by the chaos of battle, barely audible above the roar of engines and distant explosions. James worked the bolt, chambering another round, his eyes never leaving the lead bomber. He fired again. Then again. Each shot deliberate, calculated, aimed at the same vulnerable point his grandfather had once told him about during their hunting trips, where the engine met the wing. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The bomber continued its approach, death incarnate against the gray sky. Thompson's voice cut through the noise from his foxhole. "Get down, you idiot. That popgun ain't gonna do nothing." Then James saw it. A thin trail of black smoke beginning to stream from the bomber's left engine. The plane wavered slightly, its formation breaking. The smoke thickened, turning from black to orange as flames licked along the wing. The pilot tried to compensate, banking hard to the right, but the fire was spreading fast. The other 2 bombers broke formation, veering away. The damaged plane shuddered violently, its nose dipping as the pilot fought for control. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," someone whispered nearby. The bomber was losing altitude rapidly now, flames engulfing the entire left wing. It was coming down. And it was coming down directly over their position. James could see the pilot's silhouette in the cockpit, frantically working the controls. The plane was a meteor now, trailing fire and smoke, the screaming of tortured metal drowning out everything else. It passed directly overhead, so close James could feel the heat from the flames, could see rivets in the fuselage. It impacted 200 yards behind the ridge with a sound like the end of the world. The explosion lit up the entire battlefield, a mushroom of fire and debris that sent a shockwave rippling through the frozen ground. Secondary explosions followed as the bombs in its belly cooked off, creating a chain reaction that shook James's teeth. For a moment, everything was silent except for the ringing in their ears and the crackle of flames. Then the entire line erupted in cheers. Men were climbing out of their foxholes, pointing at the burning wreckage, slapping each other on the backs. James sat in his foxhole, his rifle still pressed against his shoulder, his whole body shaking. Not from cold. From the pure adrenaline of what had just happened. Did you see that? Someone shot down that bomber. Who was it? The captain came running along the line, his face flushed with excitement and disbelief. Who fired those shots? Who brought down that plane? James slowly stood up, his legs unsteady. Before he could speak, a voice called out from down the line. A private named Danny Morrison from Ohio, who had always kept to himself like James. It was Miller, sir. Private Miller. I saw him. 3 shots with that old rifle of his. The captain strode toward James's foxhole, his boots crunching through the snow. Behind him, soldiers were gathering, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. James stood at attention, still gripping his $15 rifle, waiting for whatever came next. Let me see that weapon, Private. James handed it over. The captain examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands, squinting through the scope. His expression shifted from skepticism to something like respect. This is what you used? This old Springfield? Yes, sir. James's voice was steady now, the trembling gone. Belonged to a veteran from the First War. Sold it to me for $15. A murmur rippled through the gathered soldiers. The captain looked at the burning wreckage in the distance, then back at the rifle, then at James. A slow smile spread across his weathered face. Son, I've been in this army for 20 years. I've seen men with the finest equipment money can buy freeze up when it counted. And I just watched you bring down a German bomber with a rifle that probably should be in a museum. That's the damnedest thing I've ever witnessed. He handed the rifle back to James with something approaching ceremony. The men around them began to clap. Slowly at first, then building into a roar of approval. James felt his face burning, but this time not from humiliation. From pride. From vindication. Then he saw Thompson pushing through the crowd. The sergeant's face was pale, his usual swagger completely gone. He stopped a few feet from James, and for a long moment, the two men just stared at each other. The captain noticed the tension. You two know each other? Same unit during training, sir, Thompson said quietly. His voice had lost all its mocking edge. He looked at James, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. Miller, I. The words seemed to stick in his throat. James waited, his rifle held loosely at his side. I was wrong, Thompson finally said. About you. About that rifle. About everything. You saved our lives tonight. All of us. The bombs in that plane, if it had dropped them. His voice trailed off. Henderson, Donnelly, and Kowalski stood behind Thompson, their faces showing varying degrees of shame. Henderson was the next to speak, his usual smirk completely absent. We gave you hell, Miller. Called you names. Made your life miserable. And you still stood up there and took that shot while the rest of us were diving for cover. James looked at each of them in turn. He could have said so many things. Could have thrown their mockery back in their faces. Could have savored this moment of complete reversal. Instead, he simply nodded. We're all here to do a job. To get home alive. What happened before doesn't matter anymore. The captain clapped James on the shoulder. That's the attitude of a real soldier, Miller. You just became a legend in this unit. May 1945. The war in Europe was over. James Miller stood on the deck of a transport ship heading back across the Atlantic, the same journey in reverse, but everything had changed. The rifle that had once been a source of shame now rested in a canvas case, wrapped carefully and treated with the reverence of a sacred relic. Word of what happened that frozen December night had spread through multiple units, growing with each retelling until James had become something he never wanted to be, a hero. He leaned against the railing, watching the coast of America emerge from the morning mist. Beside him stood Marcus Thompson, no longer a sergeant, just another soldier heading home. The two men had become unlikely friends in the months following the Battle of the Bulge, bonded by the shared experience of surviving hell together. "You know they want to put you in the newspapers back home," Thompson said. The Kentucky sharpshooter who brought down a bomber with a $15 rifle. "It's a hell of a story." James shook his head. "It was just one shot that happened to count. Plenty of other men did braver things and nobody's writing about them. That's what makes you different, Miller. You never wanted the attention. Just wanted to do right by your people and get home." The ship docked in New York Harbor 3 days later. As James walked down the gangplank with his duffel bag and his rifle case, he saw his mother waiting at the barrier, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. When she wrapped her arms around him, he felt something inside him finally release. All the fear, all the anger, all the pain of those years. "You came home," she whispered. "My boy came home." Later that summer, James returned to the Kentucky hills he had grown up in. He took a job at the local hardware store, married a schoolteacher named Sarah whom he had known since childhood, and built a small house on the land his grandfather had left him. The rifle went above the fireplace, and James never fired it again. Thompson visited once, driving down from Detroit with his new wife. The two men sat on James's porch, drinking lemonade, watching the sun set over the mountains. They talked about everything except the war, except that night, except the moment that had changed both their lives. Years later, when James's son asked him about the rifle and the story everyone in town still talked about, James would take it down, let the boy hold it, and say simply, "It's not about what something costs or how it looks. It's about whether it works when you need it to. And whether you have the courage to take the shot." The rifle still hangs there today, in a house in Kentucky, a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely hero carries the most unlikely weapon, and that redemption can come from the most unexpected places. Thank you for staying with James's story until the very end. If this touched your heart, if it reminded you that being underestimated can fuel your greatest triumph, leave a comment sharing your own moment of proving the doubters wrong. Hit that like button, subscribe for more incredible true-to-life stories, and let me know what kind of story you want to hear next. Until then, remember, never let anyone tell you what you're worth. You define that yourself.